All right, guys, so today we are talking about shoulders, and Keith on Facebook, you had posted a great question asking about resistance bands and more or less mentioning that you had some pains in your shoulders when using free weights and machines. You were asking whether or not resistance bands were a better option for that. And then you'd also talked about a couple of particular exercises that were causing more trouble than others, such as the incline presses and overhead presses. So there's a few moving parts here. I'm just going to start out with some general rules of thumb, some considerations when working the shoulder. And one thing to mention is that joint, your shoulder joint, is inherently more delicate than some other joints in your body, such as those around your hips. So without getting too much into the anatomy and the why, just realize that many people, if they live long enough, chances are that at some point in their life they will experience some shoulder pains. So let's look at doing some exercises and some considerations in how to take some of those pain points and maybe make things a little bit more comfortable on the joint itself. And what I'm going to look at are some common exercises I see people doing. One of them would be call it a seated dumbbell press that would be more or less in this path. And one thing to point out is that right now I have my shoulders completely abducted, meaning that I have my arms completely out to my sides, elbows pointing out, opposing away from one another. And yes, you can do presses in this path of motion, but just realize the more I take my shoulder joint into that extremely abducted position, the more I'm kind of buckling things down inside of that joint. I may actually be pinching some things that get aggravated. It's called impingement. And that's not the only way that I can do this. Realize I have a whole bunch of different places in here that I could perform that same exact movement. And chances are, if your shoulders are painful here with this overhead press with your arms all the way out to the side, maybe try just bringing them in a little bit. So instead of things being so far out here, just try turning them inward and go from there. So there's one option. The other thing, instead of going completely overhead, trying to reach completely straight overhead, it may be a little better if you put a bit of a recline in the chair that you're in. So just by doing a little bit of a recline, my shoulder's no longer completely extended overhead. I'm backing off. I'm able to back off a little bit more, give this a little bit more space inside the joint. Chances are things won't get as pinched. It could be worth a shot. Give that a try. So another thing, while I was demonstrating this movement, if you pay attention to the tempo I'm going, chances are this is pretty rare for someone to be moving this way. Chances are you're going to see more of this effect. Okay? So this kind of leads me into the point I was going to make about the resistance bands. But first, just kind of imagine this weight, this mass, and here I have a bottle of water, and I'm hoping that you can kind of see through the bottle and see the water itself. Now, as I begin to move the weight, as I begin to accelerate the mass, the solid mass in this hand, the liquid mass in that hand, they're both being accelerated. But here's the deal. Most people, they'll move in this tempo. And you can hear the water. Every time I come down, there's an abrupt change in direction. And that creates you could say a shock wave. It creates an impulse. And that force has to be absorbed somewhere in my body. And without going into too much detail, chances are you're putting a little bit of a shock into your joint each and every time you suddenly have that abrupt change of direction. So perhaps try slowing things down, moving being a little more deliberate with the change of direction, and that could be another consideration to follow. So the mass that I mentioned that's going to slosh around with the dumbbell, when you have a band, this doesn't have as much mass. This does not have that same amount of impulse. But what it does do, as you do a movement, and since we didn't really talk about the specifics, I'm just kind of making up one. What this band does do is it stretches. And as it stretches, it kind of gets heavier. It resists my motion more. And so what that does, instead of having that impulse, it actually dampens it a little bit. And so maybe that could explain why you're feeling a little better using bands versus dumbbells. I don't know, I haven't seen your particular form, but it's just a thought. It's something that I commonly see, and so I just wanted to point that out there. So once again, maybe try not going into the extremes of what your joint permits in terms of its available range. Back off a little bit, stay somewhere in the middle of its range. Same thing for a flat press. Maybe try a slight incline or a slight decline. Same sort of thing. Instead of doing your flat barbell presses this way, try turning things down a little bit. At any rate, give that stuff a try and let me know if you have any other thoughts on it. I appreciate the feedback. See you later.